we have so comprehensively tied ourselves to the Americans that we're unable to engage independently with our own region. And so whilst the government talks about, we want strategic equilibrium in our region, we want everyone to be sort of good and get on good terms and everything like that. Strategic equilibrium, one, is impossible if you have an ascendant power and a dominant power, unless the ascendant and dominant power come to some position of creating strategic space, which I don't rule out with Trump. But our problem is that Trump will not prosecute a values-based foreign policy. Quite clearly, he's not. So we have, like, for example, all of our actions, AUKUS, ramping up the Quad to summit level, all of these things show that we intend to achieve our security beyond our immediate region. And yet we talk the talk of this is where our security should be found.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Ambassador Dr. Geoff Raby. Dr. Raby is an Australian economist who served as his country's ambassador to China from 2007 to 2011. He currently runs a Beijing-based business advisory firm, and he is a friend of Professor Hugh White, the brilliant Australian geopolitical analyst who was on this channel a few weeks ago. Dr. Raby published last November the book Great Game On: The Contest for Central Asia and Global Supremacy. Today we want to talk again about Asia-Pacific, China, and Australia's part as piece of that puzzle. Ambassador Raby, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It's great talking to you because you're one of the international relations practitioners and not theoreticians, but you theorize about international relations in order then to actually work in the field with your firm and previously as a diplomat. What is your interpretation of where the world stands in 2025 and where it is headed, especially in the light of Great Game On? What's the most important thing to know about current world affairs?
I think the most important thing is we've now, in a very dramatic way, moved to a world of great power relations. And this is a big change from where we've been under the Biden administration, and in fact, where we've been for the past 50 years. It's quite clear, even in the last couple of weeks, it's remarkable to watch. In real time, we're witnessing the dismantling of the so-called rules-based international order and returning to an order that's based on great powers and great powers asserting their will across the international system.
About 2 years ago, I talked to an international lawyer here who pointed out that the whole term rules-based international order is kind of a trick of the US to shift away from the ideas of international law, because the rules-based international order, also as Chas Freeman pointed out, is nowhere defined. But now we are moving away from that jargon into even new territory. And is that territory to you one that will be more or less confined by, let's say, the norms of international law, of the international what's the word that I'm looking for? The norms of the international world.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's why I preface the mention of the rules-based order with so-called, because different states see it quite differently, and it has been US-led, and it has set the norms for the international system. But I think there have been some key elements which have being set aside now. For example, the sanctity of borders, non-interference in another country's affairs. By and large, since the Second World War, these things have been adhered to and followed, more as norms, of course, than legally binding obligations. But there are other elements. I was ambassador to the World Trade Organization for 4 years. I was very much involved with the original negotiations of the WTO. These were very much driven by the United States, and particularly creating the dispute settlement mechanism, which was a unique institutional creation. And the US invested heavily in that. Trump 1.0 set that aside, and Biden did nothing to rehabilitate it. And so The WTO now is a very pale creature compared to what we had created in the 1990s. So this is a huge change in the international system. But more recently, I mean, how President Trump has dealt with Ukraine, single-handedly indicating preparedness to concede territory that belongs to Ukraine, seeking minerals deals to offset US military assistance. These things are done outside any framework of rules. It's just an exercise of power. And this is what the new multipolar world, in my view, looks like.
Can you explain that a little bit more? Because this is very interesting, the WTO issue, because the World Trade Organization is the outcome of the previous GATT agreement, right? The General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs.
Yes. Yep.
And that itself is kind of a creation, a Cold War creation in order to, or pre-Cold War, actually. It's part of what came out of the...
Yes.
Of the Second World War, the re-establishment of rules or of an order, to facilitate trade, especially among, not especially, among Western nations, right? Among the non-communist part of the world. And those rules were supposed to help this liberal idea of free trade, right? That was the name of the game. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, well, look, a bit of history as well. I mean, the GATT came out of the failure of the US Congress in the late 1940s to ratify that aspect of the Bretton Woods agreements. The Bretton Woods agreements created the IMF, the World Bank, and there was to be an international trade organization. But the US Congress would not ratify that part of the Bretton Woods agreements. It felt there was too much imposition on US domestic policy. It reduced its freedom too much. So the GATT was a very clever diplomatic artifice where it wasn't a treaty as such. It was agreements amongst individual states one-on-one to adhere to certain commitments that they made in their tariff schedules. And it was very limited in its scope. It just dealt with trading goods, physical trading goods. The WTO basically was an achievement of US diplomats and a triumph of US politicians, liberal internationalist politicians over the US Congress. And it created a freestanding institution with its own secretariat and this is the key thing, a dispute settlement mechanism, which had the capacity to impose costs on members which did not conform to their obligations. Now, people make the mistake with the dispute settlement mechanism and think it's a judicial body. It is at one hand, but what it requires members to do is to bring their trade practices into conformance with their obligations. And the enforcement mechanism is not an external punishment as such. It legitimizes other countries to impose tariffs on the country found in breach of its obligations, and if you like, to restore balance to the original agreements that were struck in the WTO negotiations.
Yeah, this is central, because this is the problem of adjudication of grievances in international trade relations is as old as international relations itself, right? And having a mechanism to actually get to resolve pragmatically trade issues, that is important. And the WTO is such a mechanism. But now what happened is that the United States kind of checkmated its own mechanism by refusing to appoint a judge to the appellate body. Can you explain that technical detail? Because it's really crucial.
Yeah, well, the appellate body has, I forget exactly the number, 8 or 12 judges, and they're appointed by consensus of the membership of the WTO, but there has to be consensus. In fact, everything that happens in the WTO is based on consensus. It's one thing the US has always had trouble with, because a small state can block a huge, powerful state if it won't join the consensus. But it doesn't really work that way. And the US is still able to exercise power in the way it has done customarily. So with the appellate body, this panel of judges will look at a dispute. The the participants in the dispute will argue their cases. There will be a judgment made, and then that body will authorize the aggrieved party to take certain measures in terms of increasing their tariffs or imposing other restrictions against the country it's found to be in breach of its obligations. But this introduced into the WTO, which made it unique amongst all other international bodies, what we call black letter law. A law that was enforceable, written down, and something that conformed very much to the US legal system and the US approach to legal matters, where things are less done by precedent and more by black letter law that's written down. Now, the whole thing was very much a US-driven agenda, and that's the great tragedy, of course, with the US walking away from it under Trump, who, as you rightly said, refused to appoint an appellate judge, I should say, refused to join the consensus for any new appointments to the appellate body. And the appellate body members have to retire after a certain amount of time. So the numbers in the appellate body just reduced and reduced because the US has not yet joined a consensus to appoint new appellate body judges.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting how the United States goes through these regular cycles of building certain structures and then itself being the wrecking ball that tears them down again. It's really fascinating because it also speaks, of course, to the way the power distribution in the international system is set up. On the one hand, then countries have an interest in joining the US in building structures, also with a goal of a little bit confining the US, right? As in, okay, we give you this, but in return, we know the parameters within which you move, but then the wrecking ball comes and tears down the parameters again.
Yeah, I mean, but it's very hard to get to the point where you can build the structure with the US, given that everything has to be ratified through Congress. But if the US is in a period of showing global international leadership, that's possible. It can be done, as we have seen. The key thing is that it's not just the US. We need these rules to constrain the behavior of all great powers. And for most of us, most countries in the world, middle or small countries, we need to have some sorts of constraints on the behavior of great powers. That's why my opening remarks, I began with the point that we are now back in a world of great power relations. And this has been driven very much by Trump.
But there's an argument, to say that even under Biden and previously, even though people use the speech acts of rules-based international order, even though they use speech acts of international law, under the hood, they just don't conform to it. So the difference now is that we have an administration that doesn't use the hypocritical speech acts, but that the game was the same even before. How do you see that one?
Look, I think it's much more nuanced than that, and I think the US was prepared to restrain its actions in various ways through a whole lot of disarmament agreements, through WTO. In many ways, the US was prepared to constrain itself, where it did so in order to build a system that we roughly call, or approximately call, something like a rules-based order, which, of course, it's the major beneficiary, but it's also the major power. And it's not in the business of doing others favors lightly, unless it also serves its own interests. And a more stable order in this framework did serve the US interests very, very well.
So how do you think this is now going to impact the overall, let's say, the strategy of the United States? Because to me, it seems that at least for the last 4 years, the strategy was maximum pressure on Russia with this long-term goal of maybe breaking it up or, structurally winning over a peer competitor who wasn't yet subdued properly. Although John Mearsheimer and so on will argue that Russia still isn't a peer competitor, only China is. And John Mearsheimer, the offensive realism says, actually, we need to worry about China. And it's very possible, very likely, that Donald Trump tries to wind down the war in Ukraine in order to, as his Secretary of Defense actually said, focus on the Pacific. Do you also think that's what's going on?
Yeah, look, I'm very much of Meshama's view of this. Um, we haven't heard much from the Trump administration on China yet.
Yeah.
And the 10% tariff is like slapping China across the wrist with a wet lettuce leaf. We have to see really what comes next. And I'm not sure if he has such a clear, thought out sequential approach and strategy at this stage. He might, but it's very hard to see at this stage. Um, he has to deal with Ukraine as an immediate uh, political issue. He said he would fix it in 24 hours. Well, a month later, it's still there, but he's doing something to move the war along and perhaps to some sort of resolution or temporary resolution. But this is what I argue in my book, and essentially the main thesis of my book on the Great Game is that what's happening is that China is emerging now, or maybe has emerged, as the preeminent power in Eurasia. And if you follow the Halford Mackinder view of the world, he who controls the world island, which is core Eurasia, controls the world. And the important thing about this is that for the first time in much of Chinese history, China is now secure in the Eurasian continent. It no longer has to worry, as it once did, about frontier defense, which had been throughout China's history the single most important focus of security. Even in the 19th century, when the question arose in the court of the Qing whether to have a reconquest of Xinjiang, which had been taken over by an Islamic leader and made into a separate entity, the Khanate, Khanate of Kashgaria. Do they take that back because that's seen as central to frontier security? Or do they put their scarce resources, remember the Qing are very much weaker at this stage, in pushing back Europeans from the coastal areas of China, where they'd made progress after the two Opium Wars. And in the court, it was resolved in favor of reconquest of Xinjiang. And they did that because their view of their security was summarized in the phrase, where goes Xinjiang, there goes Mongolia. Where goes Mongolia, there goes Beijing. So it was almost like a Cold War domino theory, that if you lost a bit of your frontier, it would spill over into other parts of the frontier, and ultimately Beijing was vulnerable and lost. So this is highly significant. You need to think about this and look at it from the perspective of how China sees its security. Having established preeminence over Eurasia, as I argue in my book, and that's been accelerated, that process which has been underway for 20 years of China's ascendancy in Eurasia, having that been accelerated by the depletion of Russia through its invasion of Ukraine, China now is free to project power globally. And this is very analogous to what happened with the United States at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Once the US had consolidated its territory into the United States of America, dealt with the Spanish presence on its borders, and then established in the early 20th century hegemony over the Western Hemisphere, the US then began to project power globally. And first it colonized Hawaii, and then it colonized the Philippines, with China really being the ultimate objective of that expansion across the Pacific. And I think it's very clear to see this happening in the case of China. And you can see the growth of Chinese naval power as a reflection of growing security in Beijing with its capacity to defend its borders. Now, back to your other point, are we seeing some sort of reverse Kissinger or reverse Nixon, with the US becoming closer to Russia, if you like, in order to push back on China? That is a possibility. And I actually looked at it in my book. I actually, at the time before Trump's election, felt that that was a big call because their interests just seemed to be so fundamentally at odds. But Trump has set aside a lot to reestablish a relationship with Putin and to bring Putin in from the cold. So that is a real possibility, and that may be the underlying strategy. The key thing is, though, what the US has to respond to, and the US-led Western world, is China now becoming a power that can project its power globally.
This is highly interesting, and I think there's two fundamental questions here, and I don't think we can answer them. But one is, to me, because John Mearsheimer also makes that argument, right? And there was this debate between him and Jeffrey Sachs. And Jeffrey Sachs, although he agrees with the analysis, he disagrees then with the prescriptions. And the key difference is that Jeffrey Sachs says, saying that, prescribing that, because of what you just laid out, how China secured itself and now is becoming a Pacific naval power, saying that China will go and will start projecting power globally and will go into the Pacific and will branch out means mapping a inherently European US experience or pattern of thinking onto the Chinese, for which we have no precedence of supposing that this is how China would react. Although I'm not sure about that. Are there precedences in which we see that China tried to go way beyond what it perceives as its immediate borders in order to play the Anglo-Saxon European game of world domination, or not? That's the key, isn't it?
Well, it's also what do we mean by projecting power? What's China's objective here? Now, today, as we speak, there is a furious debate, a discussion going on in Australia because there are 3 Chinese naval vessels conducting live fire exercises in the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand. They're doing it in international waters. They're legally entitled to do what they're doing. But the idea that there's 3 naval vessels from China this far south and off the Australian coast and between New Zealand is horrifying people here. And I look at that and think, yes, well, if they read my book, they would be surprised at what's happening. But does that mean China's going to become a hegemonic power? I think the answer is we don't know. But it may be, and this is really my view, that what China looks all the time to achieve is a world that's accommodating and safe for the Chinese Communist Party. Mm-hmm. That's very different than an imperial colonialist model that you're talking about. And it was the imperial colonialist model that brought China and Russia into conflict historically because the Tsars and then the Soviet Union always wanted to have colonies in Central Asia. That's how they derived their security. China has derived its security historically by having tributary states. People misunderstand the notion of tributary states in China. It's not a mechanism for transferring wealth or resources to China, but rather it's the process, the act of showing the superiority of the emperor that matters. And the hilarious thing is many envoys to the Beijing court who took tribute would go home with gifts vastly more valuable than those which they gave, because the emperor couldn't lose face. The emperor had to be seen to be able to give something back that's worth much more than what he received. Otherwise, that would reflect badly on him. Yeah. And this is all about the Son of Heaven presiding over the Middle Kingdom and seeking legitimacy for his rule by showing his stature, status, magnanimity, and all of that. On the colonial expansion, we have to be very careful with China because the Qing dynasty were terribly expansionary. And the Qing dynasty committed genocide of the Zungas, Mongolian people in the western part of Mongolia, northern part of Xinjiang. At one stage, the Qing empire stretched into half of Kazakhstan, all of Xinjiang, Tibet, of course, all of Mongolia, and a big part of what's now the Russian Far East. And so, if you look at maps from Taiwan, for example, they show the borders of China as being all of this territory. far more expansionary than what the Communist Party has. But I mean, the point is, there has been periods of colonial expansion by Chinese empires, but the Qing Empire was, if you like, not Han Chinese, but it was Manchurian.
Yeah.
And so, and they're basically Mongol people, and they're expansionary. And there's an argument that the Han may not have ever been expansionary, but certainly the Qing were. So it's a very complex issue. And I mean, Kissinger talks about this in his book on China. And it got me thinking along these lines many, many years ago that you can't base security on presumptions about how another state will behave. But China, you can think the worst things about China that you may wish about the motives of the Communist Party. But as I said in my previous book, China's Grand Strategy, China is a constrained superpower. Mm. It's constrained by its borders. It's constrained by unresolved territory inside its borders, Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, now Hong Kong. But more than anything else, unlike the United States, for example, it's constrained by it is the fact that it's utterly dependent on world markets for everything it needs to survive. And they're not going to. China's not going to come and occupy vast areas of Australia because they want our iron ore. It's much cheaper and easier just to buy it on the market, as they've done for decades.
Yeah, it's the Japanese made this fundamental mistake that they thought that they have to have direct rule over foreign territories in order to survive. And if you read the documents of the 1920s and 30s, the argument that Japan has no choice, but on that tiny little island with 60 million people, there's no way that in the year 2000, 100 million can live here. It's impossible. Everybody will starve. Everybody will die. We have to send them abroad. We need to get the resources. We need to conquer. And that was a serious argument. The mistake was not to realize that you can get all of that through trade. And in the end, you have 120 million living on the island prosperously and happily because you get everything through trade and you don't need to conquer the others. So in a sense, China became what it is today by following a strategy not of conquest, but of trade, mutually beneficial trade, actually, and lifted 800 million people out of poverty, right? So that experience must also shape a national psyche of what is achievable within the framework of what already exists.
Absolutely, and it's come back to our original discussion about the WTO. Bringing China into the WTO was such a fundamentally important thing to shift that psychology in that direction. I'm not sure if China has had historically a view like the Japanese, partly because they had so much territory themselves, and it's such an enormous continent. But certainly, China's learned very well in the last 25 years that it can acquire all the resources and everything it needs for its prosperity through trade and open markets. And hence the importance, really, for peace and security in the future, that that the WTO is made to work and that the rules of that trading system can apply and accommodate rising powers like China.
So what would be the way to avoid struggling into a violent conflict between Pacific powers, China, Japan, especially the United States, who still controls or who's still the top dog in the Pacific in many ways, over misperceptions of what the other one does? Because I admire people like John Mearsheimer, I really do, but I fundamentally think that if we follow his advice of confronting China head on, then we're gonna fall into that, because we're gonna create a situation, a self-fulfilling prophecy in which the belief of a future war is going to create a future war. How not to do that, especially when we have this good chance that China actually will try to shape the order, but not try to conquer it?
I'm much more optimistic than Mearsheimer. I think Mearsheimer's problem is he's American. I'm not, right? And first of all, I mean, basically his premise, his whole analysis on Thucydides' trap. And it's all about how US maintains primacy. But there are many examples historically where great powers have accommodated each other and created space. And I've got a really interesting example in my book. There's a chapter on the original Great Game between Great Britain and Russia. That starts in the 1840s. It goes through to 1907. So it's 70 years nearly when British forwarders, as they were called, strategists in London, newspaper, think tank people, ministers in government, all were convinced that Russia, Imperial Russia, had designs on Great Britain, design on British India, and that they were going to somehow expand through Central Asia and take India from Britain. And that justified military interventions. It justified the contest known as the Great Game across Central Asia. There is, in fact, no evidence that the court in St. Petersburg ever contemplated invading India. And if you've ever traveled around the vertiginous passes of those mountains, the Himalaya, the Pamir, the Hindu Kush, you know that an invasion from Russia was just totally off the books, out of the question. But that didn't stop the British forwarders and didn't stop aggressive policy. It also, at the very end of the period, led to a terrible invasion of Tibet by Younghusband, one of the generals from India, British generals from India. But then in 1907, Great Britain and Russia sign a treaty, and it's all over. It ends in a stroke. And why? Well, partly Russia had been defeated by Japan in the 1904 Russian-Japanese War, but the main reason is the rise of Germany. And suddenly there was another ascendant power which threatened both the dominant power, Great Britain, and Russia, which was also an ascendant power at the time. And so Britain and Russia decided that they would give each other strategic space. And Britain no longer contested Russia's expansion through Eurasia. And the Tsar convinced the British that he had no designs on British India. And so these two great powers accommodated each other. And I don't see there's any reason why that can't happen. And Mearsheimer's got another concept, which is bounded orders, which he doesn't really develop in terms of practical policy, but I develop in my book a bounded order around a US-led West and a bounded order around China. And what underpins particularly the Chinese order is massive trade and investment flows, but they've also built institutions to give it coherence and structure and shared values. And these are institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS or the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. It goes on and on. And this is a very deliberate act, I think, by Beijing to hold countries close to it who share basically Beijing's values and world outlook in contrast to the US. So I think conflict, as Mearsheimer sets it up as an inevitability, only arises if you insist on maintaining US primacy. And here is why I feel a little bit more comfortable with Trump. I don't think Trump understands US exceptionalism. And if you have a view on foreign policy based on US exceptionalism, you have to maintain US primacy. That's a logical consequence.
Yeah.
But if exceptionalism is not your policy objective, if you don't even care about it, if you don't even know what it is, primacy becomes largely irrelevant. And therein, I think you do have a possibility of accommodation between China and Russia, China and the United States.
Yeah. Or just the simple view that exceptionalism is exceptional on the inside, not on the outside, right? You wouldn't want to reshape everybody in your own image because that wouldn't make you exceptional anymore, right? So you maintain what you have. And in a sense, this is maybe also another question, because we tend to view these movements as induced by the structure of the international system or by historical forces and so on and so forth. But we might underestimate just the domestic factor, right? And other, like especially US political scientists often point this out, that US foreign policy is way more shaped by domestic considerations than we might think. So the issue now that the US is internally actually decaying because of things like, 40, 50 years of free trade mentality, whereby you hollowed out your own domestic infrastructure and industrial capacity. And Donald Trump seems to be very aware about that, being himself a builder and thinking that we need to rebuild this capacity. And we can only do that if we change that reliance on having foreign peoples produce stuff for us. So, which runs then counter to the WTO ideology or basic idea, right? So how much do you think is that domestic factor actually now going to shape the US approach to other countries?
Well, I think there's no question that's why Donald Trump's president, because of those domestic policies. But what does that mean? It means the US, by and large, becomes more inward-looking and less engaged in global affairs.
Yeah, that can be a positive thing in the sense that it then creates this space that is maybe needed in order to have a power sharing agreement worldwide. No.
Yeah, exactly. That's really what I'm saying. That's the sort of logical consequence of the various points. I just don't want to. I think we've got to be careful not to exaggerate how far any of these swings will go, because for the US to disengage from the international economy is going to impose enormous costs on the US. And yes, free trade for 40 years may have hollowed out industries in the US, but it's also contributed to new industries and new growth in the US as well. And I think Trump is going to discover he doesn't seem to understand tariffs. They're paid by American people, not by foreign people. He's going to understand that tariffs will impose big costs on the US economy. So this will swing in an inward-looking, more protectionist direction for some time. But just the natural adjustment of markets and prices and costs will start to push it back into a more internationalist position. I think the key thing, though, is come back to my point on primacy, is will the US continue to insist on primacy? And primacy itself comes with enormous cost. And that's the other side of Trump's agenda. Disengage from foreign wars. He says he's a peacemaker. And that's possible and credible as long as equally he doesn't pursue primacy. And I don't get any sense that that's on Trump's agenda. So I think Trump will disengage from foreign international military occupation and activities and things substantially.
Yeah, it's at this point, what we've learned from his first presidency, at least the decisions that he himself made and not his entourage, and also what we're seeing so far, is that he is not shy in threatening violence and throwing around the weight of the United States economically and militarily. But so far, with very few exceptions, like the assassination of Mr. Soleimani, he doesn't have a track record of actually escalating to the point where war becomes inevitable.
So, I mean, there's also the episode when he first hosted Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago, and during dinner fired off 12 cruise missiles at Iran, and then halfway through dinner said to Xi Jinping, "Oh, by the way, I've just fired off 12 cruise missiles at Iran." So, he has done these things, but I see so many of these things as in the context of a bigger strategy of negotiation.
Yeah.
You flex a bit of muscle, you scare the other opponent, and they come to the table. And look, I think what he's done in Europe, it looks horrible. The way he's talked about the transatlantic alliance partners, how he's spoken about Zelensky, but everyone's rolled over immediately. Zelensky's offered a deal on raw materials, critical minerals. The Europeans are rushing to Washington saying we'll substantially increase our defense expenditure. Just with his behavior backed by the potential threat of the US walking away or doing something else, he's got the outcomes he wanted already.
Yeah, it is a negotiation strategy. it's a change. It's a clear change from the way of make believe that everybody's equal in the alliance, right? That NATO and so on are equal partners on an equal footing, and we discuss on eye level, and then everything is done with the consensus of everybody, which is a completely different strategy, and creates, of course, different perceptions in the target audience, right? And I refer these days to them as satellites, or as as tier two
Yeah.
powers that are clearly utterly dependent on the sun, right?
Yes.
Around which you revolve. But this new approach, the big stick approach, might actually create in the allies then a dynamic which over the long term might lead to disengagement, because this is a way that for the allies is not pretty to understand finally what your actual position in the system is.
Yeah, no, look, I think that will set up that sort of dynamic, absolutely. But it's going to evolve only over time.
Hmm.
And amongst the allies, there's very, very, very different interests.
Yes.
And it's fascinating to see, how much Poland has committed to its own defence. Its defence expenditures now around 5% of GDP. I sometimes worry, and I'm not a military strategist, or wonder rather that why Poland feels so threatened. Because if the best Russia can do is take 20% of Ukraine after 3 terrible years of war, I don't see that Russia presents a credible threat to Poland.
That's of
But
course that's the problem of European schizophrenia. If you believe opposing ideas about one and the same subject, then you're going to end up with a schizophrenic policy.
yeah, well, that's true. Yeah,
Like
yeah,
Russia is on the one hand the greatest threat to Europe ever. On the other hand, you also believe it is super weak and can be defeated on the battlefield with
yeah,
just one more wonder weapon, right? So
yeah, yeah,
there's that's why I'm so at loss with the Europeans. They don't adhere to one or the other or the third idea about how international relations works, but they adhere to all of them at the same time, and then boom.
yeah. Well, they've not had to address it until now.
Yeah.
They've had the comfort of US security. They can have all that
Right.
because they don't actually have to make any real hard choices. Now, today, they must. And the picture's changed dramatically, which leads to another, I think, important question. What does Europe do about Russia?
Mm-hmm.
And I address that at the end of my book, because if China is the preeminent power of Eurasia, then you have a world system that's unbalanced. How do you balance China in a world where the Americans have basically gone home because they're perfectly secure in their hemisphere? China will never represent a systemic threat to the United States. And Europe, what does it do? How does it balance China then? And in my view, the only way it can balance China is to re-Europeanize Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Russia under Putin has pivoted to the East, but the East is not Russia's natural home. And there's great, conflict, great tension in all those relationships as well. There's real tension, despite the public appearance of a friendship without limits, of mutual suspicion, mistrust, and everything under the surface between Moscow and Beijing. And Putin's never backward in making sure Beijing knows that he also has more options in the East than just China. For example, his visits to Pyongyang, to Hanoi, his close relationship with Modi, all countries which are China's problem countries, shall we say, for China. But the reality is, I think that Russia's natural fit is with Europe. Europe needs to re-Europeanize Russia, bring it closer to itself in order to balance China in Eurasia. And this becomes a very big historic mission for the Europeans to get their heads around and to begin thinking about this for a post-Putin world. As Putin's not going to be around forever. And what do you do? What sort of Russia do you have afterwards? But it won't happen without effort and really serious commitment to an agenda like this.
On the other hand, there's also the argument in Europe among thinkers that I agree with a lot, that it's hard to see how China would ever be a security threat to the Europeans, although there's people who think so. But a security threat is unlikely. Maybe an unequal trade partner who will impose its trading terms on the Europeans. That's possible, but a security threat is hard to see. So wouldn't it be in Europe's best interest to try to be a mega Switzerland and just be neutral in the upcoming disputes between the Chinese and the Americans, and maybe the Chinese and the Russians, if it comes to that, and be that neutral ground on the other side of the mega continent to maybe even help keep a balance in one way or another.
Yeah, and the only problem with that analysis is what happens to Russia, because if Russia's drawn closer and closer to China, then Russia can rely on much more Chinese support and backing in any conflict in future it might have with Europe.
Yeah, which is why it should be in the interest of the Europeans to be good friends to the Russians. And not,
Precisely.
At the end of the day,
Precisely.
I mean, it's so interesting.
Re-Europeanize Russia, bring them back into the fold.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that's from the European perspective, right? From the Russian perspective, is would Russify the Europeans, right? That's the but
well, whatever.
It doesn't matter. But it's so interesting to me to see what happened between Russia and China also during the Cold War, because the two almost went to war with each other over their borderlands.
Yes.
And China still has a lot of border disputes, even with some of its most important trading partners, especially India, right? But the Chinese have been working on creating mechanisms that do not rely on adjudication, but that rely on smart conflict management to de-escalate with the Russians over a period of 20-25 years, and with the Indians. And these with the Russians, I think at the moment everything is more or less clear. With the Indians, you still have disputes and you still have tension, but the system is such that the tension won't lead to a spiral of escalation. So wouldn't that imply that even though Russia and China will probably remain suspicious toward each other at a certain level, they both now have this modus vivendi that you manage those relations? And this is what went through my mind when I saw how Russia negotiated a security agreement with North Korea, having effectively a neutrality clause in there, saying if ever one of us ends up in a dispute with a third power, and who else could it be than China, then the other party, contracting party, will not do anything to the detriment of the other contracting party, which is basically a neutrality agreement.
Yeah. Look, I mean that's right. But I think I think here the key issue is, as power shifts to China against Russia, that the power relationship becomes more and more unequal. How will China behave? Now, for the moment, it's very much in China's interest to join Russia in a united front against the West. And there's no doubt that Xi Jinping and Putin share a common sour attitude to the West. That's for sure. I don't think Chinese elites do in any way, shape, or form. And China is integrated in the international system in much deeper and far more complex ways than Russia has or will ever be. But there is still, for example, 1 million square kilometers of Chinese territory in Russia, which was lost under the unequal treaties of the Treaty of Beijing of 1858 and the Convention of Peking of 1860. And Chinese people know about that, talk about it, think about it. And just last year, the year before now, 23, the Chinese ministry responsible for official maps decreed that all the 8 cities in Russia, including Vladivostok, will now in future be referred to only by their pre-Russian name. So Vladivostok was a fishing port before the territory was lost under the Treaty of Peking in 1860, and it had the name of Haishan. And then it became Vladivostok, which translates into English as Conqueror of the East, so you know what the sort of Russians are on about. But now, or since April 23, it has to go back to its original Chinese name of Haishanwan. And
On
there are eight
Chinese maps. Mm.
on Chinese maps, official maps,
Mm.
8 cities. And Russia made a formal diplomatic protest over this and so on. But, you know, it comes up all the time. It's like a whack-a-mole. Every time the Chinese Communist Party leadership want to present a united front, somewhere these issues pop up.
Mm.
And yeah, I mean, and in 1969 they did fight a hot war in the summer of that year in the over the islands in the Ussuri River. So I don't think that stuff can be wished away.
No. And
And
both of these states are very conscientious of their history and historical trajectory. So I think both of them are aware that even though right now they're on a high of their relationship, it's a question of time until you get to a new low.
yeah, exactly.
Maybe can we use the last 5 minutes or so to talk a little bit about Australia and the Pacific, and maybe also Indonesia, which finds itself in a very uncomfortable sandwich situation. With Professor Hugh White, he pointed out that Australia is in this like psychological insecurity state, and therefore like adhering even more to this dogma of no, we need to support the US come what may, and even if it means going to war, we need to do that. It's really important. How do you see Australia's approach to this changing world?
Yeah, well, firstly, Australia will always go to war if America goes to war. Mm. So it's hardly a revelation that's hardly a revelation. That you have to accept that as the default setting of Australian security policy and foreign policy.
Right.
The big problem for us now with Trump, and it goes back to my points about exceptionalism and primacy, is that we have so comprehensively over the last decade, and Hugh's been a tremendous critic of all of this, and quite correctly, we have so comprehensively tied ourselves to the Americans, or glued ourselves to the hip, as I say in my previous book, that that we're unable to engage independently with our own region. And so whilst the government talks about, we want strategic equilibrium in our region, we want everyone to be sort of good and get on good terms and everything like that. Strategic equilibrium, one, is impossible if you have an ascendant power and a dominant power, unless the ascendant and dominant power come to some position of creating strategic space, which I don't rule out with Trump. But our problem is that Trump will not prosecute a values-based foreign policy. Quite clearly, he's not. But so we have, like, for example, all of our actions, AUKUS, ramping up the Quad to summit level, all of these things show that we intend to achieve our security beyond our immediate region. And yet we talk the talk of this is where our security should be found. And that's why we completely lack credibility, I think. And was professor from Sydney Universities was the Australian Financial Review international editor, said Australia speaks with a forked tongue when it comes to the region. So we have a deep conflict at the heart of our foreign policy. So Trump will make that even more pronounced when he goes and that doesn't pursue a sort of values-based foreign policy.
So there's no chance that in the near future Australia will suddenly come around and realize that it is, in a sense, the most southern part of Southeast Asia. You know, the thing stretching all the way down and ending ultimately in New Zealand. That probably won't happen. That reconceptualization.
No, well, I mean, the Chinese Navy's visit the last couple of days might help. It's clear the Chinese Navy thinks we're the southern part of Southeast Asia, the way you put it. No, I think psychologically we have always needed to have a great protector. And we've been extremely fortunate that the two dominant powers, first Great Britain and then the United States, are powers with whose values we align, institutions we share, world outlook we share. As I said in my last book, with the end of the unipolar moment, And Australia finds itself in a genuine multipolar world where we are now. We've reached that point. For Australia, it's a dystopian future because we have to choose and make choices that we really don't want to make. Now, we have abandoned the possibility of strategic ambiguity. Would that happen again? It would have to take a very big shift in domestic public opinion in Australia for us to be able to do that. And so I see AUKUS, for example, whatever the technical merits or demerits of it, whatever the strategic value or not of it, I see it as a losing strategy for us in terms of our foreign affairs and security, because we have nailed ourselves completely to that project. And it speaks volume to the region that we don't see our security in the region, we see our security from the region.
Right. I view it the same way and think that a reconceptualization would make sense, but it's probably currently unlikely as far as I understand. This was a very highly insightful talk. So, Ambassador Raby, if people want to follow you or read from you, where should they go?
Well, I guess my books are available on Amazon. So just look Geoff Raby up on Amazon and find the books. And my email is my name, Geoff Raby at geoffraby.com.
If you want to know more and engage with Ambassador Raby, please write to him and read his books. I will try to put the links into the description. Ambassador Raby, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Pascal.